Hey, Carol.
Well, I would like to say welcome to everyone here on Zoom tonight. I'm Carol Frank. I chair the program committee, and it's my pleasure to be with you tonight and to welcome you to our rescheduled program for Emery Roth and his history and the work that he did throughout New York City and one home in Great Neck. As all of you know, we've had some technical issues, but from what I read about Mr. Roth, he was a very determined person, and he didn't let any kind of adversity get in his way. And that has been our attitude tonight, even though we have had quite a few technical problems. So I want to introduce to you our speaker, Andrew Cronson. He is a very accomplished young architectural historian and expert on Long Island residential architecture, who has been introducing us to hidden treasures in Great Neck, the most recent being the telephone building in Great Neck Plaza. Mr. Cronson received his undergraduate degree from New York University Steinhardt School of Culture, Education and Human Development. He will be starting graduate school in the fall at Columbia University. He currently serves as the vice president of the Save Chelsea organization, where he is responsible for the advancement of their special projects and digital initiatives. He has also led a multi-year campaign to restore a monumental mural by noted artist Julian Binford. His preservation work has been featured in local and national publications ranging from the New York Times, Newsday, AM New York, Untapped Cities, many others. He is also a member of the Wings Club, Archivist Roundtable of Metropolitan New York, and the New York Academy of Sciences. And I am most thrilled to say that he is one of our newest board members for the Great Neck Historical Society. We are so thrilled to have Andrew be a part of our board. He has already made so many contributions to Great Neck. So with that, I introduce you to Andrew Cronson. I'm not hearing anything.
Andrew?
Was muted. Someone, sorry.
There we go.
My apologies. We are running on a very odd technical situation after the technical issues from last 2 weeks have just persisted to this week, and I'm running off my phone. So for any issues, please forgive that in advance. It's kind of chaos today. So thank you all for joining us in the second installment in a series to spotlight the many famed architects that make Great Neck such a vibrant and historic community. For residents and visitors alike, these remarkable buildings enhance the streetscape to make a unique sense of place that makes Great Neck distinctly what it is. Tonight we'll be discussing Emery Roth, who is considered one of New York City's most prolific architects in the 20th century for residential and commercial architecture. We will learn about his long career, impact in the architecture profession, and his connections to Great Neck. Only a handful of his works were outside of Manhattan. Amazingly, this is only a small sampling of the work Roth did, and the slightest preview at the firm of Emery Roth and Sons, which was their successor firm. Roth himself is a bit of a forgotten architect in terms of having the sort of notoriety of breadth of his career as other architects might have. In point, I tried to search for Emery Roth on YouTube, and under his name came up videos on Rick Santorum, a trailer for a horror book that takes place in one of the buildings Roth designed, music by Jason Mraz, and more realtor listings than you could ever imagine. Still only one or two talks in total that discuss Roth. Who was this architect who had an outsized influence on the look of New York City for almost a century? We will find out. Next slide, please. Emery Roth was born in the small town of Galzex in Hungary, now known as Slovakia, in 1871 to a prosperous Hungarian Jewish family, which was involved with the management of the town inn in Zemplin County, which served as its social center. He was well educated as a child and regarded in such high form that he often played with the royal children. Roth was fluent in Magyar, Slovene, German, and studied Latin. In his spare time, he attended balls, theatrical performances, participated in town meetings. However, this luck would change after his father died in 1884 and their family fortunes took a tide for the worse. The family decided that Roth would be best suited in America, making the journey as an immigrant at just 13 years old with a family friend. He was placed in steerage during his ocean crossing and upon arrival, took a train to Chicago with just a name scribbled on a piece of paper for direction and $4 for himself. Extremely resourceful and ambitious, Roth managed to earn a living by doing a variety of odd jobs. One of those was in an architect's office. Next slide, please. Not shortly thereafter, Roth was hired to be a draftsman in the preeminent Chicago firm of Burnham and Root during their planning of the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. Working for them on this project gave Roth an opportunity to hone his skills and take inspiration from the massive library that the project had. It was during this time that he met Richard M. Hunt, who was one of New York's premier architects. After Hunt ran into the drafting room, the firm panicked and so astounded that someone was that young was in their office. Hunt was immediately impressed by Roth and promised a job in his office upon returning to New York. Roth was able to work for Hunt for a brief period, but upon Hunt's untimely death, he ended up working with Ogden Codman Jr. instead, where he learned the skill of high-class residential work. Next slide, please. Working with Hunt and Codman, Roth was able to get a deep view of the aspirations of the wealthy, which would end up being invaluable toward his later career. In 1898, Roth struck out on his own by buying into the practice of Theodore Stein and Yancey Cohen to become Stein, Cohen, and Roth. It was a rough start with only largely modest commissions from members of the Hungarian immigrant community that were comfortable supporting this new architect. That same year, the name of the firm was changed to Emery Roth Architect, and they did a design for alterations to Cafe Boulevard in Lower East Side. Next slide, please. During his early years, Roth established a strong following with support of the Jewish emigre community of New York. In 1899, he had his first big break designing the Saxony Apartments on 89th and Broadway in Manhattan. Then shortly after, he designed the Hotel Belclair, which is pictured just a few blocks away. When the Belclair opened on January 12, 1903, it was on the city's most luxuriously appointed hotels. Keep in mind that Roth was only 30 years old at this time. Based on his success, the influential developer brothers of Bing and Bing took note of Roth and had him design a building on West 136th Street, which cemented a long relationship with that firm. The Bing brothers were known for their stately, tasteful buildings that often had multiple setbacks with private terraces. The prosperity of the 1920s allowed Roth's business to flourish, and his practice became one of the largest in the city. He would go on to design for bigger developers like Samuel Minskoff and Harris H. Uris. Next slide, please. Designed in 1903, 127 Hester Street and Lower East Side was built for a group of recent immigrant Romanian Jews who sought to establish a congregation. As the Gothic Revival style had become known for Catholic works, and the Greek Revival style was likened to paganism, the Moorish Revival style was a fitting but rare choice for him to use. In 1973, the building was converted by Hale Garland into an artist studio, where it remains today. Next slide, please. Designed in 1916, 344 East 69th Street in Manhattan was built in a Hungarian vernacular style for a congregation of Calvinist Protestant Hungarians who had settled in New York following 1898. Being an immigrant from Hungary himself, Roth was a natural choice for the job, and his knowledge of their traditional vernacular buildings was very apparent. This was the only church Roth designed in his career. Next slide, please. Designed in 1918, 2215 Benson Avenue in Brooklyn was built for a congregation of roughly 60 Orthodox Jewish families that had settled in Bath Beach, Brooklyn. This continued Roth's work in building religious facilities for recent immigrant groups. Next slide, please. Roth would also get his start doing commercial work, including the splendid Fashion Tower in 1925 at 135 West 36th Street in the Garment District for the Marmo Realty Group. In this case, the exterior was ornamented with imagery reflective of the women's garment industry. At the entrances are a pair of colorful terracotta peacocks with their ornate tail feathers fully evident. Winged putty, one carrying shears, unfurl a band of fabric emblazoned with the building's name above the second floor. Next slide, please. These details resulted in a splendid and striking streetscape, rife with symbolism that was evocative of the feel of the era, which was bursting with manufacturing. Amazingly, the building is not a landmark, but the left entry portal was remade entirely in 2014 for renovation after it was brazenly removed in an earlier alteration. This design shows brilliantly the transition in architecture of Roth's practice from earlier Art Nouveau and vernacular styles to more modern forms. Next slide, please. At this point, it is important to distinguish the genre of apartment hotel which Roth tended to design from this point forward. Apartment hotels provided people with the option of a permanent residence with the provision of housekeeping and cooking services. Typical units would range in size from 1 to 3 rooms and would come with a serving pantry in lieu of a kitchen. For the wealthy, it was popular to have an apartment hotel unit in the city and a country home in the suburbs. Instead of designing, say, hospitals or movie theaters, Roth doubled down on these types of buildings as he saw them as the future of New York. Next slide, please. .465 Park Avenue was designed in 1925 by Roth in collaboration with Thomas Hastings of the firm of Carrere and Hastings as a luxurious apartment hotel for Arthur Brisbane. The Ritz Tower was intended to be the ne plus ultra of apartment living. Classified as a hotel to get around zoning restrictions, the 400-room building was operated by the Ritz Corporation to give an air of luxury. It had 3 restaurants and a complex dumbwaiter system for having room service delivered. Notable tenants included Greta Garbo, Kitty Carlisle, William Randolph Hearst, and Clive Davis. Next slide, please. The main restaurant was lavishly decorated with several murals painted by Hungarian-born Willy Pogany, one of the era's most commercially successful artists. In the 1950s, the space became home to the famed Le Pavilion restaurant, which became the premier hot French restaurant in America. Next slide, please. In the first 3 floors of the Ritz Tower were many small businesses, especially art galleries, art dealers, and interior decorators, including the Museum of Irish Art. The National City Bank was the largest tenant in a large ground floor banking space, along with the well-known beauty salon, Charles of the Ritz. Next slide, please. Designed in 1926, 24 Fifth Avenue was built as a high-class apartment hotel, replacing a Brevoort mansion. Like with Roth's earlier works, he used brick to provide texture and terracotta elements for interest. The building was landmarked as part of the Greenwich Village Historic District. Next slide, please. Echoing back to its early days, the streetscape is enhanced now by a ground floor cafe, which spills out onto the street. Next slide, please. Designed in 1926, 12 West 72nd Street was intended as an apartment hotel with 175 suites. The design combined details from various periods of Italian architecture with the overall massing of skyscrapers. It would become a landmark of the Upper West Side skyline. The Cromwell has a powerful base of rusticated limestone, a strong brick midsection with subtle materials punctuated by a few broken pediments, and carefully massed section with a tower culminating in an elaborate top. It became Roth's favorite work. As Jewish architects tended to primarily work on the West Side, this was the start of his famed tenure designing along Central Park West and the surrounding neighborhood. Next slide, please. Designed in 1929, 145 Central Park West was built as a 26-story twin-towered building for a syndicate headed by Henry W. Pollock. The apartments were accessed from opulent twin lobbies, which contained terrazzo floors, marble walls, custom light fixtures of bronze and frosted glass. At the top of each tower are temples set on simple brick podia, which are encircled by colonnades of smooth columns with foliate capitals. The towers are modeled after the Choragic monument of Lystraces. Try and pronounce that quickly. I think I spell it right, pronounce it anyway correctly, but the 2 towers loom above Central Park, almost like a cathedral. Next slide, please. Some of the residents of the San Remo included the Eddie Cantor, Jack Dempsey, Steve Jobs, Diane Arbus, Dustin Hoffman, and Steven Spielberg. Next slide, please. As an interesting crossover, the interior of the San Remo was coincidentally designed by the Theo Hofstadter and Company, which was owned by one of my neighbors until he closed the firm in the early 2000s. Next slide, please. Designed in 1928, 211 Central Park West was built as a 23-story apartment building for the HRH Construction Company. The exterior was decorated with elements from the Federal Seaboard Terracotta Company, which was a typical supplier for Roth's firm. As a unique design twist, the 3 towers, hide water towers, intended as a very lavish building, each of the 128 apartments were the size of a typical townhouse. However, only weeks after opening, the stock market crashed. Its owners were ironically just fine. Next slide, please. Tenants have included Jack Donahue, Isaac Stern, Rock Hudson, Beverly Sills, John McEnroe, and Diana Ross. In 1987, the building was declared a New York City landmark. Next slide, please. 39 Fifth Avenue was designed in 1922 as an apartment house, which replaced one of the many mansions that lined Lower Fifth Avenue. The 14-story building was intended to be upscale. Next slide, please. What really sets it apart in the streetscape are the rich, multicolored polychrome terracotta loggias at the 3rd and the 11th and 12th floors. Next slide, please. "204 West 101st Street was designed in 1927 as the Bow Park Garage, a 5-story parking garage. Ordinarily utilitarian affair, Roth was able to bring great interest and texture through the use of brick and terracotta elements that symbolize travel. Next slide, please. Designed in 1929, 300 Central Park West was built to a design by Morgan and Holder, with Emery Roth as associated architect for the LK Building Corps. The 30-story building replaced the El Dorado Flats as a more middle-class building than Roth's other works. It was built around the same time that Roth was designing the San Remo, so it was a bit of recycling of elements. Next slide, please. The entrance portals are reminiscent of German expressionist design. Some of the residents of the El Dorado included Groucho Marx, Marilyn Monroe, Phil Donahue, and Carrie Fisher. Next slide, please. Designed in 1938, 140 Riverside Drive was built for a development syndicate headed by Henry Kaufman. It had 250 apartments with over 1,000 rooms total, with up to 15 units on each floor. As the last large residential building that Roth worked on as the firm switched to commercial offices afterwards. It was designated a New York City landmark in 1895. Next slide, please. For the architects, they intended to build one of the largest edifices of its kind ever built, initially modeled in the Italianate style. Perhaps in honor of the SS Normandy, which had set sail just earlier, Roth altered to the streamlined modern style. The dual tower design evoked his earlier works for the San Remo and El Dorado, but in a forward-thinking manner. Next slide, please. Roth died in 1948. The building on the left was completed the same year and was the last work Roth did in his lifetime. It is a very stripped-down version of the massing he loved and used so heavily. The two towers, as you'll recall, was a feature of the San Remo, El Dorado, Normandy, and multiplied earlier at the Beresford. He started with this one tower for the Oliver Cromwell and kept going with it. Next slide, please. Despite his busy work schedule, Roth found time to socialize and participate in professional and civic affairs. He was a member of the American Institute of Architects, National Democratic Club, City Athletic Club, Metropolis Club, and the Central Synagogue. Throughout his life, Roth maintained close ties with many recent immigrants, and they, in turn, looked upon him not only as a successful and talented architect, but the very personification of the American dream. In New York City and beyond, the Roth name is so synonymous with New York City's development that their influence cannot be overstated nor overlooked. It is a rare look at a firm which adapted to changing tastes from the earliest secessionist vernacular to ultimately changing to the international style. Roth stands along Rosario Candelar, J.E.R. Carpenter, Schwartz and Gross, and Cross for boldly shaping New York's residential world. This past Sunday, from when we were supposed to meet, would have been Roth's 151st birthday. In spite of how long ago he designed, his work still has incredible relevance for both our past, present, and future. Next slide, please. By the 1950s, the international style swept through America, and Emery Roth's firm shifted to commercial works in the manner of the new modern. Clients wanted Mies, not old classicism. They initially tried to design a more classical mode, but that was a bit out of fashion after World War II. The other issue was the lack of craftsmen and relative ease of building in steel. Unlike in the case of Ralph Walker, who you learned about in my last presentation, Emery Roth and Sons was booming. As architect of record, they were involved in at least 150 structures. Interestingly, the look of Mad Men era corporate Park Avenue is almost entirely the work of Roth's firm without exception. Numbers 90, 99, 277, 280, 299, 300, 320, 345, 350, 400, 410, 430, 450, and 460 on Park Avenue are all designs by their office. Next slide, please. Designed in 1948, 488 Madison Avenue was one of the Emery Roth and Sons' most acclaimed designs, built for the Uris brothers as a stylish and profitable office building that spoke to the modern era. It was designed by Emery during the Emery Roth and Sons era. The Look building was designated a New York City landmark in 1910. Next slide, please. .785 Fifth Avenue, usually called the Park Sink, was designed by Emery Roth and Sons for Fisher Brothers developers in 1960. The year the building opened, the New York Times described it containing 66 mansions and described it as being one of the world's most luxurious multiple dwellings. Notable residents included David Geffen, Denise Rich, Robert Daly, Barbara Broccoli, and Fred Zola. Some of their other works as associate architects during this period include the Pan Am building with Walter Garopus and Pietro Bellusci, but they only handled the design development drawings. Though it should be noted that they only agreed to the project for the Pan Am building if Grand Central was kept as part of the design. They were also slated to work on the World Trade Center with Minoru Yamanazaki, but they parted ways due to the heavy workload required. Next slide, please. Looking at the tenure of Emery Roth to Emery Roth and Sons, it is a very rare look at a firm which operated for around a century. They adapted to changing styles almost effortlessly and were able to gain a global following. In fact, they were the only office of a Western firm that had an office behind the Iron Curtain. They went all over the world sourcing materials, and they were able to design in many faraway places. Next slide, please. Moving to Long Island, 17 Hillside Avenue in the village of Great Neck Estates was built in 1920 for Francis Hennequin, who was an Austrian member of the famed Ziegfeld Follies theatrical troupe. As Great Neck was an epicenter of culture and arts during the Gilded Age, it was a remarkable ecosystem of writers, playwrights, directors, actors, and musicians. Being in the heart of the cultural district and around the corner from the Great Neck Playhouse, Hennequin was right at home. Having Eastern European roots, the choice of Roth as architect was very fitting. It was one of only a dozen single-family homes that Roth designed his career, mostly situated in Westchester and the Borscht Belt otherwise. Next slide, please. Design is very reminiscent of Roth's early works, imbuing the classicist design with elements of Italian architecture. He was able to combine details from various periods of Italy with the overall massing of skyscrapers in all of his works. The interior was lavish with expansive paneling and a dumbwaiter, which was very rare for the early 1920s. Next slide, please. True to form, Roth used polychrome terracotta as the primary ornamentation in line with the brickwork to emphasize the form of the triumphal arch. Roth loved tile work and didn't fail to incorporate it into this design. Next slide, please. As an interesting aside, the home was originally on a double lot, as residences tended to be, which allowed for expansive lawns. During that era, Hennequin was given an alligator, and she had it as a pet in her garden. She kept it in the bath at night and allowed it to roam the property during the day. However, as their historian Ilse Kagan remarked, a woman who was a neighbor since 1960 and saw it firsthand, it was tamed as a loving pet. Hennequin would eventually have to donate it to the Bronx Zoo, but visit often until she no longer felt the alligator remembered her. It is actually very possible that visitors today are seeing the grandchildren beyond of Great Neck's own alligator, which is kind of wild. Next slide, please. One of the elephants in the room, sorry for the pun, is the condition of the brickwork, which brings this home's recent pending sale as great concern for preservation. Being as speculative as Great Neck is becoming, it is all too easy for a builder to see this condition as insurmountable, even though it really isn't, and opt to build something oversized on the lot instead. While there is exterior work needed, it is not outside the scope of being doable to bring this bona fide landmark to its deserved glory. The current state does not replace the significance of the site, which is a rare lark of a residential work for a preeminent architect of national acclaim. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, much like the Great Neck Playhouse, 17 Hillside Avenue is in great jeopardy because Great Neck Estates still lacks a landmarks law. Again, there is nothing to protect this home from a simple demolition permit. This is especially confounding because the immediate number of possible landmarks is only a handful that would be representative of the village, and yet there is no push to protect these outstanding examples. There is a misnomer that landmarks preserve an ember, halting all progress. This is not a red light to stop, but really a yellow light to proceed with care moving forward. Our history is not a free-for-all. We want the best of the old to survive for our future. Next slide, please. One might say, where do we start in protecting the best parts of Great Neck Estates? Given that the Village Hall is not only an excellent example of adaptive reuse, but it was actually a site that was once threatened with demolition already. 4 Gateway Drive is a great first landmark. While I wish I had gotten an oblique view in a photograph, this was once a home designed by George J. Hardway, a Cleveland architect, for Frank Crowell, who is the promoter of the Great Neck Estates development. Its second owner was John Jacob Atwater, who was an industrialist. In the 1950s, the home was purchased at a reduced rate with the stipulation of the area be named Atwater Plaza. In the 1980s, a demolition plan was defeated by residents, but it could have been easily lost. Next slide, please. 6 Gateway Drive is not as famous or known for its architecture, but for its deep, nationally significant cultural importance as a location where F. Scott Fitzgerald lived and wrote The Great Gatsby. While the design has changed, again, the cultural resonance of the setting and the sense of place for this Gatsby era is the driving force of much of Great Neck's pride of place. Could you imagine the loss of losing this legacy of Great Neck on a whim? It would be horrendous. I will also note that while the 2 main estates that were thought to have inspired the book, the Point in Kings Point and Land's End and Sands Point, were both demolished recently, and thusly robbing us of that tangible part of this history. Next slide, please. 9A Myrtle Drive is one of Long Island's greatest treasures. It is one of the only Frank Lloyd Wright homes outside of upstate New York. It was designed in 1937 for Benjamin Rayburn, who was a publisher. An outstanding example of Usonian design, the Rayburn House has remained intact with owners who appreciate design. Without a facade easement, the next series of owners could demolish this home with a flick of a pen, losing this hidden gem. You might think that anything by right is sacrosanct, but they are slowly being lost, even in areas without development pressure. With all due respect to the owners, the impact of right in our culture cannot be overstated. This should be the highest priority for preservation and recognition in Great Neck. Next slide, please. 49 Cedar Drive was built in 1909 by Gustav Stickley, founder of the American Craftsman Movement, for Frederick M. Hill, who was secretary of the YMCA of New York. It is one of just a handful of original Stickley homes on Long Island. While it has an honorific resignation by the Great Neck Historical Society, there is no actual protection, other than praying a sympathetic owner comes along when it is resold next. Next slide, please. 160 Middle Neck Road was designed by Leroy P. Ward for Charles Finlay, who had developed Kensington across the street. It has the proud distinction of the first cooperative apartment built on Long Island. Surrounding the building, formal gardens were designed by Lewis and Valentine, a noted horticultural firm out of Glen Head. Next slide, please. 3 Tulip Drive was designed in 1928 by Frank J. Forster of the firm of Corretto and Forster in the French farmhouse style for Raymond F. Kilthau, who is a member of the Spalding and Kilthau flower brokerage firm. Forster also designed a home at 22 Clover Drive for Lee S. Burnham, but unfortunately could not get a picture in time for it. And that home notably had landscaping by the Olmsted brothers, who were the descendants of Frederick Olmsted, the architect of Central Park. Very famous architect. Next slide, please. 80 Middle Neck Road was built in 1908 as the Barron Building, which housed one of Great Neck's earliest car dealerships. The 3 medallions from the old Lamothe Cadillac dealership remain just above the windows on the front of the store facing the road. You could say, well, the storefronts are too altered, though there are certainly scores of restoration architects who could bring back these historicist fronts that would only enhance the look of the building. Additionally, just behind the storefronts on Elm Street is a collision shop, which occupies the service area, which is also a rare survivor from that period. Next slide, please. One other possible landmark may be the Great Neck School's Cumberland Center at 105 Clover Road, which was designed in 1953 by the famed Chicago firms of Perkin and Will. It is much in line with their National Historic Landmark, Crow Island School in Winnetka, Illinois, which was designed in collaboration with Eero Saarinen, which ushered in an era of progressive school design. The same massing principles were utilized several years later for this school, which was in itself awarded in a national design competition by the American Institute of Architects. Next slide, please. Let us not have a repeat of the loss of the Great Neck Playhouse. Instead of what could have been an excellent adaptive reuse project, even in the current state pictures, one of Great Neck's gems was sacrificed. Yes, even in the state picture could have been reused. As Ilse Kagan, their historian, has remarked, this is Great Neck's biggest shame. I can only hope that we will learn from this and take action without haste, so this legacy will not be in vain, and the legacies of Emery Roth and others will be honored to the fullest extent. Next slide, please. I want to end on a personal note, and forgive me if I get emotional reading this. Like many families who immigrated to America, mine spent a lot of their time in the Lower East Side in the early 1900s. Largely due to landmarking, you can go back now and see a streetscape that has remained so constant in spite of all the change around it. One can retrace the steps of where their family lived, ate, played, and worshipped, because it's been methodically kept intact, knowing years later the public would benefit. Nobody needed to do any of this, to preserve any of it, but that community knew the value of keeping it alive. I believe that if we can capture the essence of Great Neck Estates and beyond by protecting the best of the old, it will tell those decades from now what it was like to live here and grow up here over the many centuries that Great Neck has been a community. For this is one of the most great, most irreplaceable gifts that we can leave for our future. Next slide, please. Lastly, I want to give a thank you and a hat tip to the many people for making this presentation possible, and credit to the photographers where credit is due so they don't sue me. And on that note, I will also apologize for the technical difficulties again. It's been a very interesting weeks trying to get this presentation together. Very pleased to be here, and I appreciate your patience with that. And on that note, I will leave it up to questions. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I know how much time and effort and love you have put into all of this research. The first time I ever saw Mr. Roth's house in Great Neck Estates, I didn't know who built it, but I knew it was unique and not like anything else. I want to again say welcome to all of you. We are extremely happy that 3 members of Mr. Roth's family have joined us tonight. We are so grateful, and I want to turn it over to all of you to make any kind of comment that you would like or ask questions. I know Andrew is eager to continue the conversation.
Hello, my name is Bob Osman, and I was invited by Andrew Alpern, who is in the frame next to me, at least on my screen. I'm delighted that he did so. I've been a resident of Great Neck Estates for, well, through my mother and father since 1961. I'm presently living in the house I grew up in, and I'm at 22 Hillside Avenue, and I can see 17 constantly out of my window, including right this second. I am delighted that someone's going to purchase it. It's been empty and fallow, and the winds have been wreaking havoc. And I was wondering, perhaps since I'm a resident here, there's something I can do at meetings at the Village Hall to foster the preservation of some of these homes, which not only in Great Neck Estates, of course, but I don't have any hegemony over buildings such as the Great Neck House on Arundel Avenue. I don't know what the state of that preservation is, if it will be, or a few other buildings of note since I've lived here. It's 10 years now, and through my childhood until I went off to college. Any case, I thank you so much, Mr. Cronson. It was fantastic. And it taught me a lot, and I'm going to even look further on some walks around the neighborhood, because they're all within blocks of here.
Well, thank you so much. You're making an excellent point. People who are in the community, especially those who live in the village of Great Neck Estates, are really in the best position to influence the trustees to consider passing a landmark law. When that is done, it opens and a village becomes certified. It opens them up to tremendous resources as well as potential for grant money. So there's a lot that people need to learn about landmarking and the benefits of it, and to not be afraid of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I really we would all be so delighted at your participation, along with other residents. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, I think so too, because I've seen far too many homes here, not perhaps of the landmark designation, but reduced to rubble and replaced with what I'm calling McMansions up to almost to the property line in the street, including one directly next to 17, which was an empty lot, actually 2 lots for many years, right next to 17. I remember the alligator, by the way. I used to
You
go and
do?
watch it. Oh, absolutely. I would go there, and it was in a fenced-in pool, like a little kiddie pool. And during the day, it was behind 17 on the Elm Street side, in a fenced-in area, but a pretty low fence. You could go and touch it if you liked, which wasn't my idea of fun. But to watch an alligator, literally in the midst of Great Neck Estates was quite fascinating.
I saw some other people nodding their heads about the alligator story. Anything to add to that?
No, nothing that comes to mind. I was in the house once when I was in high school. A girl on my bus route, which was always meeting here at Hillside and Maple, the stop, lived in that house and invited me in to look around once. And I can tell you, I was fascinated. It was just beautiful, even in some disrepair. We're talking the early 70s. But I think a terrazzo floor, I remember an ornate staircase, and the rest of it is lost to my memory. But it was a fascinating trip at that time. I don't remember too much else. The neighborhood has unfortunately changed a lot. New buildings have come up, and a lot of the empty lots, including the one next to 17 on Elm Street, which was pictured in one of the slides, was built actually after I went off to college. So, it was a big lot before that, right next to the Kagan. Ilse Kagan lives next to that building on Elm Street, next to where the empty lot was on Elm. And her son and I went to elementary school together and well, through high school. Anyway, thanks a lot for listening. And
Thank you.
I'm going to do whatever I can and engage our neighbors to help out with that. Thank you.
I'd like to point out that I've been peripherally involved in a historic district on the North Fork out in Mattituck, interacting with a friend of mine who has a house out there, and she got involved in restoring the house. It had had a fire in 1948, and the corner 3rd floor turret of the house burned up and was taken off. The remains were taken off and a flat roof installed. And she had a photograph of what it had looked like originally. And she wanted to rebuild it, but ran into problems by the well-meaning but misguided Landmarks Commission for the neighborhood. And they had passed a rule saying within the historic district, you could only build 2 stories. You couldn't build a 3rd story. But of course, any existing 3-story buildings were grandfathered. I helped her to convince the Landmark people that it was a good thing to restore accurately the remains of a landmark building that had disappeared in the past. It isn't just enough to get a landmark district and a landmark commission. You have to have commissioners who understand how to administer a historic district. And it takes a good deal of subtlety. We have the same problems here in Manhattan, where I live, where restoring historically accurate sidewalks is blocked by the Landmarks Commission, who say you can't do that in a landmark district.
Hold on, I have to turn something off. Okay,
In a landmark district, you can't change anything from what it was when it was landmarked. Well, that's destroying the whole importance of a landmark district, which is to restore what was, if it's feasible, and if it isn't, build something that's appropriate. Keep in mind that if you are going to promote a landmark commission for Great Neck, do it very, very carefully.
Well,
That's a very good point. One of the things about having a commission is to ensure that the people who are involved and the regulations and the determinations that they make are done in a very precise and categorical manner that is backed up with practices, is in line with the National Park Service guidelines. The New York City Landmark Commission is serve on the board of the Historic Districts Council, where I'm a part of the committee that reviews the public approval process for the LPC. They give testimony to speak to the best possible changes that can be made for buildings. And it's a very unique process of trying to figure out how to best balance what already exists with what is trying to be changed, what people would like to do. But it certainly beats whatever the changes we made without a landmark process, because at least there is public input in this, as opposed to someone just demolishing whatever is there and building whatever they like, generally maxing out the zoning, maxing out what they can build, most often tearing down all the trees that are on the lot and putting something that has no context or relevance to the surrounding neighborhood. So while there are drawbacks to every possible decision you could make, I believe that having a landmarks law would only be a great benefit towards preserving the little remainder that can be found in Great Neck Estates and throughout Great Neck.
Unquestionably, having a landmark law is better than not having it. And in fact, I feel that the New York City landmarks law is unquestionably the best piece of legislation that New York City has ever enacted. It has had more benefit for the city overall than any other law I can think of. Unfortunately, it's taken up by what I call a professional preservationists who would, if they had half a chance, landmark absolutely everything in Manhattan, including a ham sandwich. And in fact, my old friend Bob Stern, who I have great respect for and who knows how to build appropriate buildings, once said in so many words that if he had the power, he would landmark the entirety of Manhattan Island. Well, that's, to my way of thinking, a little bit absurd, but unquestionably, having a landmark law to prevent the kind of tear downs and inappropriate construction that you mentioned is very important.
I will also mention that New York City is a bit different than what sort of goes on Long Island, but you look at, let's say, Roslyn Village. It is an extraordinary example of a historic village where they have very strong protections And you see it as this desirable place to live. People seek it out to live in historic homes. The film industry seeks it out specifically to film on location. I believe either it was Law and Order or one of the other sort of NBC or CBS crime syndicates was there about a month ago filming, because they want to be in these areas where you can see the history tangibly. And that is really such a boon for economic tourism and a major boon for the local economy to be filming on location.
One of the things you
I know
have
the
to be,
price generally for,
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
One of
I was
the,
gonna say I know that,
yeah,
just go ahead. I won't say anything. Sorry.
one of the disadvantages of exactly what you've described is was mentioned in a New York Times article a year or so ago that pointed out that the village, because of the preservation and the landmarks law relating to the village, it has become a locked down, very, very high end district for exceedingly wealthy people, and has completely removed it along with large swaths of other landmark districts from the possibility of affordable housing. And that unfortunately, too often, landmarking has been used as a way of fencing out middle-income people from upper income areas. I would hope this would not happen at Great Neck Estates, but we know the demographics of Great Neck.
Unfortunately, or fortunately, Great Neck Estates is housing or income or middle income or affordable housing community. I don't know if there necessarily even is a single affordable housing unit in Great Neck Estates, or if their code would allow it. However, historic preservation, at least in New York City, does preserve many of the city's lower income and also middle income and affordable housing. There is a building on Lower Fifth Avenue, not far from, I think, 39 Fifth Avenue, which Roberts is building, which in the Greenwich Village Historic District. And it will actually end up in the end with a building, I think, that is about double the size, removing all of the rent stabilized and rent protected units, and building units in the end than there were to begin with in that building, because these will be masonette, triplex, and duplex units that only the upper echelons of the country can afford. So in many cases, we are preserving, as preservationists, some of the last affordable and reasonably affordable units. But at Great Neck Estates, there won't be any real change or chance of having apartments necessarily, but it will ensure that the single family units that people come to Great Neck Estates for preserved, and they will be appropriate moving forward. I'm not talking about keeping the entire village as a historic district. What I'm proposing is to have a law that will protect the best examples, what people who are bona fide experts, even more expert than I am, who say these are truly significant buildings. It may only be 5, 10, 15, 20 sites, and these are what is best representative of the village. And that way people can come back 20 years from now and say, oh, look, there's Emery Roth, there's Frank Lloyd Wright, there's the Kenwood Apartments, how amazing it is to be here. And that's really what it's about. It's not keeping things in stone. That is not how landmarks work. It is to make sure that any changes moving forward to the most significant buildings are significantly thought of. There is public input, and whatever is done in a careful manner that respects and preserves the fabric of history. And that's really how landmarking operates and should operate in its best form.
We're open to other comments and questions.
I know there was a question from Bonnie Salkind, who asked, what does it take to get a landmark status and other different levels and requirements? So having a landmark status in the Great Neck Estates case would require a landmarks law, which would be typically, most villages have one. Great Neck Plaza, Village of Thomaston, Village of Great Neck, they all have a landmarks law, Kings Point as well. And it is basically a generally uniform amendment to the village code, which decides, what the different legal requirements are and what the legal procedure is for a village law. And once that would be, once it would be enacted, it would become part of the village code, and a landmarks commission of typically 4 or 5 members who are typically well versed in real estate, law, preservation, architecture would be part of the commission. And they would either receive nominations from the public for a potential landmark, or they would, as a commission, decide to make a priority for what they would like to study, and they could bring it on their own behalf and do a fact-finding period to decide, is this building historic? Are there records that prove it? Are there documents, photos, anything in the archive that will say the significance? And once that is determined, it will go up for a public hearing in which all the people who are reside around the proposed landmark will be notified of the change. The owner will be notified so they can make their case during the hearing. And it would go for a public session to hear what the neighbors, the residents, experts, others from the community and the public would like to say about it. Once that is, the hearing is over, the determination would be made typically within 60 to 90 days. There's typically a clock which is starts once the hearing starts in most landmark laws. And after that, the commission would make a determination and would decide to either uphold or deny landmarking nomination. Assuming that a landmark is nominated, in most cases, villages would have a clause in their law which would say that any permits for alterations to the exterior of a building would require landmarks approval, and there would not be any permits granted until the landmarks board approves changes to be appropriate and sympathetic. And assuming that the approval is given from board, it meets the standards, it is appropriate and historically accurate, an owner could then make whatever changes they request. Landmarks law does not require that any owner gives public access to their property or tours. It does not require anything typically more than meeting the typical code that all other village residents are required to be on the same standard of, and having any changes be approved by the commission. But typically historic properties that are in historic districts and that are on their own are usually more stable in price. I know a Brookings institution did a meta-analysis of it, that properties tend to stay at least stable or increase in value compared to non-landmark properties. And there's been empirical evidence that show that historic properties do not lose value because of their historic status. And in many areas, they are some of the most profitable and valuable properties because people know that they will have neighbors that will be making sympathetic changes and are in a community that values its history and values its sense of place. And you can only need to look to Great Neck Plaza's landmarks, Roslyn, the landmarks in Huntington, the many historic districts in New York City, to see that these are some of the most valuable, cherished, unique, interesting, and economically productive places that one can find throughout New York State.
question. I live at One Hillside Avenue, and I don't know if you would know, or maybe Jean would know. Why is it that One Hillside Avenue is Great Neck Plaza, although we're facing Great Neck Estates?
It's just the way the building is oriented, but the residents in that building are allowed access to our garage because you can't park on the street, but and the property is in Village of Great Neck Plaza, but it's an oddly configured and access building. There isn't anything else like that one in the village. But I don't know the answer to why. It just is, it is.
And I would love to have seen pictures before the townhouse was there, what the actual building, the front of it would look like before the townhouse was ever built there. Love my building.
Yeah, there's features in that complex that could be brought out better. Yes, absolutely. I just wanted to mention, where you still have other things you wanted to say, Wendy?
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for your wonderful presentation. I'm just so blown away by all the facts and highlights that you've given us. Thank you so much. I know that there are other villages on the peninsula that do historic preservation of properties, but I don't think any of them have the certified local government status like we have with New York State. So when we do a landmarking, it's akin to a state landmark. So it's kind of a second layer. It's got more teeth in it, if you will. And there are certain requirements that have to be met according to New York State as far as who sits on the landmarking commission, what are their qualifications. You got to give copies of their resumes and what their, every year give a report as to who your commission is made up of. So it's a little bit more stringent on a village, but we feel having that is a nice feature of our preservation law.
Jean, isn't one of the parts that one of the things that a village would do in becoming certified is that you then do a real accounting within your village, an assessment of which buildings should be considered. You really do an inventory.
Absolutely. And prioritize, which should go first, which should go second, because you could have, you just went through the properties in Great Neck Estates, and just sticking with the estates, you've got probably 20 properties you could do. So it's quite extensive, and no, it's terrific. And we make walking tour maps of the properties that we've done. And we have a historic district too, Bond Street, and wrapping around the corners is a historic district, which includes properties that are contributing and non-contributing. So no, we've got quite a few different features in our landmark preservation properties. Did I answer your question, Carol?
Yes,
Okay.
we appreciate the leadership that you provided. You really did forge a path in Great Neck amongst the villages, and it took it very seriously.
Well, we have 3 federal properties, and it was those properties that kind of guided us to let's raise up some of the other ones. My office was located in 8 Bond Street, which is a federal landmark, and also the post office is a federal landmark. And around the corner, the building with the jester on it is federal landmark property. So those are all the things that are, some of the properties that make you feel like they're so unique to Great Neck, and you know you're home when you see them. It's, at least it does to me. It reminds me I'm home. And they're very special, very, very special.
Any other comments? Jay, I would like to introduce Jay Mankus is our president. Jay, if you'd like to have some closing words.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, if Robert Osmond's still there, probably the Great Neck House was his library when he was younger. He mentioned that he was worried about it. It's
You bet.
Yep. And it's really run by the Parks Department. We actually met there monthly before COVID. And it's been completely refurbished inside, and it should open to the public September, October.
Wonderful.
So that will still be around.
A relief.
Yeah. And the other thing, not that it matters to anyone, I actually was one of the early residents in 24 Fifth Avenue when the Brodsky organization made it into a co-op. The real thing I'd like to say is, A, thank you all for participating. B, we hope and pray you'd care to join our little effort here. The more people we have, the more brains, the more support, ideas. You can just go to greatneckhistorical.org and follow the instructions on how to become a member. It's cheaper than 2 frappuccinos, I think.
Well, again, I especially want to thank Andrew Cronson, who has really put a lot of heart and soul and sweat and frustration with dealing with technology into being with us tonight. So even with a little hiccup here and there, the preservationists go forward. And that's it takes a lot of determination. And so we are very fortunate to have you have such an interest and have such a passion that you're able to share with us. We really, truly appreciate. So if there are no other announcements, we are hoping that we will actually be able to be in person and have a tour at the Merchant Marine Academy in the fall. That we have our fingers crossed for that, and it would be great to see many of you in person. Maybe we could have a little camera. I don't know if they would allow it or not, Andrew, to share with our Zoom friends from out of town. That's been one of the blessings of Zoom, is that so many people who don't live here can be a part of this. And we really love having people from all over attend. So I wish you all a wonderful night. Stay cool, stay healthy, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. We would clap for you, Andrew, if you could hear us,